God.
Hey everyone, 'tis I, Niche. So, remember the 8-bit Sonic games? Because I didn't. In the grand scheme of things, I've always kind of looked at the Master System and Game Gear Sonic games as being a bit like the wind. Gone. And with the... What I mean by that is that, at least in my eyes, and in the eyes of a number of Sonic fans too, they've always just sort of existed as a lifeboat of sorts for the Game Gear since it was never fully able to take on the Game Boy in competition. In a way, something about these games always came off as being more of investor relief software to keep the money men from getting too anxious over the Game Gear's struggles in the market, as opposed to, you know, a product that was made out of a genuine desire to translate the series to 8-bit hardware. Oh, and to give Tech Toys something to do absolute gangbusters with in Brazil too while they were at it. But that sort of begs the question though, do any of these games hold up? Well, the answer to that is coming right up. Back in the 90s, Sega struck gold when they created Sonic the Hedgehog. We all know the story. He replaced Alex Kidd after he married Amy Mann and took her last name, and then stood out as being the first major threat to Nintendo in the Super Mario series. The character had attitude and a handful of truly great games under his belt that generated enough goodwill for the guy to basically sit out an entire generation of games before coming back in a big way with 1999's Sonic Adventure. And yet, that's only part of the story. Between 1991 and 1996, Sega dropped a handful of original 2D Sonic platformers for their handheld console, the Game Gear. These games included the likes of Sonic the Hedgehog, Sonic 2, Chaos, Triple Trouble, and Blast, as well as 7 other games that are more explicitly spin-offs for the character that I won't be discussing today. In them, you take control of Sonic the Hedgehog as he tries to stop the nefarious Dr. Ivo Robotnik from doing vaguely evil things for 5 games in a row. While 4 of these 5 games were actually co-developed for and got released on Sega's 8-bit console, the Master System, they're more synonymous with Sega's portable console on account of receiving somewhat limited releases for their home hardware. Of the games that made it to the Master System, only Sonic 1 ended up getting a North American release. The games were developed by 2 studios, with the adaptation of Sonic 1 being created by none other than the famous Yuzo Koshiro's company Ancient, and the other games coming from Aspect, who was a fairly prolific developer for the Game Gear. Back when they were being put out, most of these games even managed to get some genuinely good reviews. For example, our buddies at the 90s German publication Video Games gave Sonic 1 an 81%, which is a pretty high score given what I've seen them hand out to other games over the years. Sonic 2 did just about as well, receiving a lot of scores in the 80s back in the day while also earning a few 90s. Sonic Chaos did alright with critics too, and was even covered by a man with a great name and a haircut that I genuinely kill for, like With My Bare Hands, but was quickly followed by a more vocal dip into the 60s and 70s with Sonic Triple Trouble and... well, we'll just save Sonic Blast for last. While they've somewhat been forgotten by the average Sonic enthusiast, these games ended up getting fairly regular re-releases throughout the early 2000s too. Each of them made it onto something ranging from plug-and-play consoles like Coleco's 2006 Sonic handheld as bonus content on the GameCube release of Sonic Adventure, or that era's Sonic collections, and even on the 3DS's Virtual Console. The Sonic Adventure DX version was actually how I ended up experiencing this thing for the first time too. I distinctly remember playing my GameCube one night when I was around 8 or 9 and checking out Sonic 1 and Sonic Drift that way. However, as cool as it was to unlock these Sonic games that I had never heard of, let alone played before, I also don't want to lie and say that I thought much of them. Even though I was a fan of 8-bit games on my family's NES, 8-bit Sonic just didn't feel right to me at the time. I thought it was neat that they existed, but as a kid who didn't know any better, also wondered who'd want to play these over the Genesis games.
This is so funny. I cannot believe it.
Funny.
Especially since we had stuff like the Sonic Mega Collection readily available with all of those games curated for us. These Game Gear games even got recently dolled up for another re-release as a part of Sonic Origins Plus, a re-release of Sega's Genesis-era Sonic collection from 2022 that itself contains several re-releases of his classic games. I'm personally writing this video in early May, so while I can't speak to the quality of those re-releases or anything, though I'm sure they're fine, I mean it's Game Gear emulation for crying out loud, it's awesome to see that Sega still wants us to remember that they exist in the first place.
I would like to say that I was wrong.
And I'm very, very sorry.
And for good reason too, right? The Genesis technically has 5 Sonic games on it if you count Sonic CD and Knuckles as their own games, which you probably should since they were their own SKUs, so the fact that you could accurately call those seminal 16-bit releases only half of the character's origins is a pretty big deal. So yeah, today I'm gonna dust off my trusty tier list board that I like to use from time to time, and I'm gonna compare each of these alternate classic Sonic titles for the Game Gear in order to figure out whether or not they hold up. And for the record, I'll be comparing each of these games within the context of them being their own sub-series. So like, if I give something an S tier, it doesn't mean I think it's an S tier Sonic game necessarily, just that it's an S tier title in this specific continuum. Going into these reviews, my gut instinct tells me that given the sheer volume of games I'm about to play, at least 1 or 2 of them will turn out to be pretty good, which is really exciting for me because Sonic's my favorite fictional character of all time, and yeah, being able to experience 5 new classic 2D Sonic games is really awesome. Before we continue though, a quick question of the day. What's a portable adaptation of a series more associated with console entries that you really like and want to recommend? Be sure to leave your answer to the question of the day along with your recommendation, or just a recommendation for a game to play in a video in general, over in the comments. I'd love to hear your answer. On top of that, feel free to subscribe to my channel if you like what you're seeing so far and want to see what I put out in the future. You could also subscribe to me on Patreon or do a one-off tip to my Buy Me a Coffee if you want to make my taxes a living hell this year. And with that out of the way, on with the video. Starting with the Game Gear's first take on the series, we have 1991's Sonic the Hedgehog. This game came out several months after the Genesis version and is the only one I'll be covering today that wasn't made by Aspect. Instead, it was handled by Ancient, who's responsible for a number of classic games from the era, namely Streets of Rage 2 and 3, as well as the 2 Oasis games. Right from the start, it's obvious that they were interested in trying to do more than just cram the Genesis game onto an 8-bit console. And this is really commendable since the 16-bit version was designed to make full use of its console's hardware, meaning that it more likely than not wouldn't have worked here. Because of this, 8-bit Sonic 1 does away with the loop-de-loops from the original game, features smaller sprites as well as simpler stage designs, and even replaces the dizzying bonus stage the other version is known for in favor of a new design that feels more like a riff on Spring Yard Zone than anything. With these changes in mind, it's abundantly clear that this is more of an alternate version of Sonic 1 that has its own identity as opposed to being just a simple demake of that Genesis game. One that, aside from the occasional blurb of derpiness, is a fairly refined alternative. That said, there are still similarities between the two games, such as how they both start with Green Hill Zone and also feature both Labyrinth and Scrap Brain Zone. These recycled levels are all different from their more advanced counterparts though, and while they do feature the same general theme and stuff, do stand out in their own special way. Anyway, Sonic's moveset is basically one-to-one with what you're expecting for the character. Because this is Sonic 1, you don't have the ability to spin dash yet, and you'll need to rely on your zippiness and jumping skills to get around, while also being able to duck into a ball if you want to roll through enemies, and just like in any other Sonic game, you can pick up rings to use as insurance in case you get hit. However, unlike in the un-Santiago'd Sonic 1, you aren't able to pick them up again if you've taken damage. While one could reasonably assume this would radically change the way one would approach the game, since the concept of rings basically gives you infinite durability in the Sonic series, the effects it has on the gameplay are fairly minimal. It makes the game a bit harder than it would be otherwise, sure, but 8-bit Sonic 1 isn't that tough in the first place, so it's kind of a good thing. That said, I won't pretend that this isn't a bit weird in and of itself. I mean, seriously, I'd love to know why one of the defining characteristics of the series was left out of what's technically its second game. It may have come down to them not being able to figure out how to implement it without tanking the frame rate or something, but until I get a notarized letter from Yuzo Koshiro confirming that, I'm just gonna go with the theory that Sonic was having some sort of mental breakdown and refused to pick him up off the ground. One weird effect this has on things is that it makes Sonic 1 feel a bit more like Mario now, since rings basically function like mushrooms in that series. The entire game has this sort of Mario adjacent feel to it too, now that I think about it. Without his trademark loopiths de loopiths and near invincibility, a massive component of Sonic's design feels unfulfilled. Now, granted, it's worth mentioning that the original Sonic 1 hardly remembered to make good on that part of its design too outside of Green Hill Zone, but things definitely come across as being a bit more pedestrian and subdued here without him. Thankfully though, the game is still quite a bit faster than what you got in titles featuring Nintendo's mascot. It's just weird that this game struggles to feel like a Sonic title despite being the second one. There are 6 zones in all, plus the special stages, and as I said earlier, 3 of them are lifted directly from the Genesis game. And like, look, I genuinely don't mind that we got recycled level themes or anything, though anyone who forces you to play another version of Labyrinth Zone is deserving of several streets worth of rage, if you know what I mean, but welcoming so many points of comparison between this game and its 16-bit counterpart wasn't gonna do anyone any favors. The funniest part about it too is that I genuinely liked what Game Gear Sonic had to offer on these levels. As an example, Green Hill Zone may be radically different from the Genesis version, but it still encourages you to explore your surroundings by giving you this cave or tunnel system to run through, and it also replaces the excitement of the missing loops by giving you these ramps to fly off of and into the air. Taken for what it is 30 years later, it's a good zone. It subverts what we know and love about Green Hill Zone while also still managing to fulfill the basic gameplay loop that made it such an engaging level. The original zone themes do kinda leave a bit to be desired though. For starters, even though the first act in Bridge Zone is a pretty fun jaunt, the second one is an honest-to-God auto-scroller. Yeah, that's a thing in Game Gear Sonic. Granted, it's only one level in this game, but it's for good reason that it is, because yikes, it's one of the worst levels in the thing. The screen moves at a glacial pace, and likely due to the very limited space of the Game Gear's screen, you aren't given much to do while you wait for the level to progress. Once you factor in the collapsing bridge segments that'll actively punish you for wanting to go fast in a Sonic game, I just didn't like it. You ever see that short by the rejected cartoons and World of Tomorrow guy Don Hertzfeldt called Wisdom Teeth? The one where a stick figure spends like 6 minutes pulling on another dude's wisdom tooth stitches? It's like that. A long, never-ending wait.
An der Schluppe erobben tausende Gummiholen.
The next zone after that definitely picks things up a bit, but it also isn't particularly special. Jungle Zone's gimmick involves these logs that are cascading down a waterfall that you'll need to jump across, as well as features some more vertically oriented stage design. There's nothing wrong with it, but there's also nothing particularly great about it either. The log thing is cute, but that's a fairly common motif in video games to begin with, and hell, Super Mario Bros. 2 USA literally did that a couple of years earlier. And the last zone in the game, Skybase Zone, isn't great. While the level design itself is pretty fun and I do like the aesthetics of the area, it's all but completely ruined for me due to the screen flashing in order to simulate lightning strikes. I actually have a really low tolerance for this kind of stuff in general, so it could just be me, but I also didn't enjoy the level because of it. I think it would have been more tolerable back in the day though, since the Game Gear's screen was fairly tiny and its backlight didn't have the sort of kick any remotely modern display has, but I also think you should be careful with it just in case. At the end of the third act to each zone, you square off against Dr. Robotnik in a one-on-one fight. It's exactly what you think it is, and while I can't say that any of the boss encounters are gonna set the world on fire, they weren't bad, and I'd say they were about as memorable as the fights in the Genesis game was. If you're the kind of person who wants to 100% the game and get the true ending or whatever, all you'll need to do is locate the 6 Chaos Emeralds that are scattered throughout one of the levels in the game's 6 zones. Unlike in many other Sonic titles, they're basically just tucked away somewhere waiting for you to find them. I thought I was gonna hate looking for them at first, but I ended up enjoying finding the few ones that I did. It goes a long way in incentivizing you to comb through these stages, and while I didn't end up going for 100% myself, I could see it being a fun activity to take up during a future replay. Aside from it meaning I'll need to trudge through this game's version of Labyrinth Zone, where your mobility underwater is even worse than it was on the Genesis, and with having to stave off a migraine searching for the emerald in impeding seizure zone, it seems like a pretty good time. Despite the fact that the graphics naturally had to be downgraded from the 16-bit version to work on the Game Gear, Sonic 1's also a pretty good looking game. Things have a slightly chibier look to them than what we got on the Genesis, but it works well and it has a lot of charm. A lot's been said about this game's screen crunch issues over the years, and yeah, for fairly good reason. Seriously, just play the Master System version if you're genuinely worried about it, but I didn't particularly mind it on account of it allowing me to get nice and close to the character sprites to appreciate their workmanship. Also, I think in the case of Sonic 1 on the Game Gear in particular, I feel like the screen crunch has been somewhat overstated. Like, yeah, it's definitely hard to see where you're going and stuff at points, but it's also an early handheld game, so I wasn't really expecting much. Musically, Yuzo Koshiro really ought to be proud of himself. Aside from dropping solid renditions of a few of the tunes from the 16-bit version, he also composed some truly delightful originals. I'm sure everyone already knows this, especially since I'm dropping the video a few weeks to a full month after Sonic Origins Plus inevitably led to a slew of Sonic Game Gear videos on the site, but Bridge Zone is easily the best thing to come out of this game and arguably all of the Game Gear Sonic games' soundtracks. It was so good that its melody almost undoubtedly had to have had some level of influence on the Janet Jackson banger Together Again from her 1997 album The Velvet Rope. But outside of that, his music for Skybase Zone and the new tunes for Labyrinth and Scrap Brain Zone are also fantastic. Overall, Sonic 1 on the Game Gear is a great game. I wouldn't say it holds a candle to the original or anything, but it's a worthwhile companion to that one and has a distinct enough identity to exist separate from it. Even with its more level-headed stage designs and the numerous restrictions that were placed on the game by the hardware it had to run on, Ancient did a great job here, and I think it's worth checking out sometime. I give Sonic the Hedgehog on the Sega Game Gear a solid A-.
That was cool!
Just a year later, 8-bit Sonic fans were graced with the sequel to the first Sonic the Hedgehog game, just like their compatriots on the Genesis were. Aptly titled Sonic the Hedgehog 2, it follows Sonic on a quest to rescue his new buddy Tails from the evil Dr. Robotnik, who probably also wants to take over the world or something. Something interesting about the 8-bit version of Sonic 2 is that it's actually the first game to feature Tails on account of it predating the Genesis version by roughly a month. However, Sonic's the only playable character here. Tails' first entry where you could actually play as him is still the 16-bit version. Being the first of several 2D Sonic games developed by Aspect, it drops some of the main focuses of the design formula from that first game and introduces a stronger emphasis on level gimmicks than what was found there, to the point of one of the zones literally being called Gimmick Mountain Zone. Like 8-bit Sonic 1 though, it did get a Master System version, albeit one that never got released in the US. As far as its level structure goes, Sonic 2 also owes a bit more to the Genesis games than it does the first Game Gear one. For starters, it actually features loops. I guess being the wizards that they are, Aspect figured out how to make it work on the hardware. The game also allows you to pick up rings now too, which is also really nice. You still can't spin dash or anything like that, but a lot of the underlying tech here definitely got a huge bump over what was on display in that first Sonic game. Is it a perfect conversion of those gameplay elements and design? No, not at all. In fact, it doesn't even want to be that, but it's cool to see all the improvements that could be made in a single year and how they were able to bring 8-bit Sonic more in line with what fans would have expected from him. Plus, I do seriously respect the hell out of Aspect for trying to give the game its own identity. Every zone has a unique gimmick going for it, such as throwing a hang glider at you in one level, mine carts, or rotating gears. The actual enjoyability of those gimmicks may vary, like a lot, but it was definitely ballsy to try so hard to put their own stamp on things. I mean, it's safe to assume that they were at least aware of Sonic 2 and CD while they were working on this, so it's interesting to see how different it ended up being from either of those games. It's just a shame that it isn't, like, particularly good. Even though Sonic 2 features a number of quality of life updates over that original game and is a smoother, more ambitious adventure, its stage designs end up faltering in a big way on account of the amount of screen crunch it has and the way the levels weren't properly designed around it. Of all the games I'll be reviewing today, Sonic 2 is definitely the one that suffers from the worst instance of screen crunch. It'll bite you in the ass as soon as the second stage of the game when you're in a minecart and can barely see obstacles before it's time to jump to avoid them, and it'll only get worse from there. Seriously, it skyrockets the need for quick reflexes to the point where I genuinely recommend strapping yourself to the Ludovico machine from A Clockwork Orange so that you won't have to blink and potentially miss an obstacle. Even worse, you don't get any rings during these boss fights, which makes them even worse than they need to be. And for the record, this was also the case in Sonic 1, but at least in that game, the boss designs were a bit simpler, so you didn't quite feel that pinch as much. An especially egregious example of screen crunch leading to this game being a bigger pain in the ass than it honestly needed to be is the first boss. It has a super simple setup of you just trying to dodge obstacles while trying not to fall into what looks like the Sarlacc pit until Robotnik decides to, I don't know, kill himself, but it's absolutely ruined by how cramped things are. Speaking of Robotnik, even though he's the main villain of this adventure, you're only gonna see him once in the game if you don't plan on going for the good ending. After the first zone, every other boss in the game is a uniquely crafted badnik, such as the Giant Claw in Sky High Zone, Oil Slick Dugong in Aqua Lake Zone, and even Sonic Running Chromium in the amazingly titled Scrambled Egg Zone. Seriously though, while the level itself is more tedious than trying to pull teeth with soggy chopsticks, the level name gets no notes. The only way this wordplay could have been better is if Dr. Robotnik or Eggman's real name turned out to be Benedict Eggman. If you want to get the true ending, you'll need to explore each of the levels in order to track down the Chaos Emeralds like you could in the first game. But honestly, I couldn't bring myself to do it at all this time around. Exploring the stages in this game just didn't click for me on account of how many obstacles were in the way and how I often felt like I was being punished for not having enough time to dodge them. Without getting all the Chaos Emeralds, the game will come to an end after you fight a precursor to the other Sonic 2's Mecha Sonic. This'll trigger the game's bad ending where, after the credits roll, you'll see Sonic looking at the sky in memory of his kidnapped buddy Tails, who presumably died because you couldn't save him. Which is, you know, pretty dark. I can only imagine that some of the kids who figured out what was being implied here were potentially traumatized by what they just saw. I mean, it sounds like a joke, but try to put yourself in their shoes for a sec and picture yourself as a 7-year-old that had just poured hours into getting to the end of this thing, only to find out that you failed and your new bestest buddy Tails is dead. And not in the fun, we can rebuild him, we have the technology so he'll look the way he did in Sonic Prime way either. He's gone. To quote Willy Wonka,
"You get nothing. You lose. Good day, sir."
Not to get too off topic, although let's be real for a second, I tend to do that all the time, it's sort of my thing, but it also reminds me of when I went to go see that Mary Poppins sequel in like 2018 or so. So like, spoiler alert if you actually care about the sort of mediocre Mary Poppins sequel, but a major part of that movie's story involves the characters grieving over their mother's death, and at one point in the movie, I distinctly remember a 5 or 6 year old in the row in front of me and my date asking his mom whether or not she was gonna die someday. Which is dark, much like the implication that Robotnik turned Tails into a fox meat omelet. Man, teaching your kids about death is awkward as hell. Props to all the parents watching that had to do that at some point. Back on topic though, one of the other things I noticed here is the fact that Sonic 2 can have some seriously haphazard level designs. I don't know if this was Aspect's first platformer or something, but the game is rife with spike pits, automated tube sections that force you to pick a path, and springs that take you to other springs and presumably take you to even more springs. Some of these layouts even remind me of what we'd eventually get at the worst moments of the Sonic Advance series, because while I wouldn't call them out and out terrible stage designs, they also lacked in the fluidity and clarity that the mainline series had going for it on the Genesis. It ain't all bad though. While the less I stop to complain about the hang glider, the better, some of these level gimmicks can be pretty fun. And it even has its own version of Green Hill Zone too, for that matter. Only here, it's suddenly called Green Hills Zone, which is kinda hilarious in its own right. I also genuinely liked the art style in this game. It managed to take a look that served the first one well and one-up it. Character sprites are more detailed, there looks to be more animation this time around, and the environments are also more fleshed out and alive than they were previously. Some of it can be excessive. For example, Aqua Lake Zone has a truly hideous dither pattern on the water that feels off even when you add some scan lines to it, but of all the Sonic games I'll be covering today, I think this may be my favorite of the bunch as far as its graphics go. It even has these super cute thumbnails before levels, which confusingly shows Tails by Sonic's side on them, because he obviously lingers so heavily on Sonic's subconscious and is the Tyler Durden to his unnamed protagonist.
What the f is going on here?
Mom, is Tails gonna go live with Grandma in heaven?
Oh, come on! I also think the music is pretty great too. None of the themes go quite as hard as Bridge Zone did, but if that song earned itself a Janet Jackson nod, some of this stuff is at least becoming of a LaToya or a Tito.
I'm Michael Jackson, you Tito. Your ass belong to me.
And weirdly enough, it even features Sonic CD's Japanese and European theme, You Can Do Anything, which is also known as Toot Toot Sonic Warrior, tee hee, haha, on Green Hill Zone, which is super random. While Sonic 2 on the Genesis was a huge improvement over the first game on just about every front, the Game Gear version leaves a lot to be desired. It's a massive glow up over the first game as far as the technical specifications of the titles are concerned, but its level designs take a big hit due to the screen crunch that's too hard to overlook. If you want to play this one, you'll be better off going with the home console version. That's true of all the games that got multi-platform releases, but it's almost a prerequisite in the case of this one specifically. Sonic 2 on the Game Gear isn't bad by any stretch of the word, but it's definitely irritating. I give it what I got in high school biology, a C+.
That was easy.
Coming up next, we have 1993's Sonic Chaos. Robotnik's at it again with trying to conquer the world. Take a shot every time he tries doing that again. And this time, Sonic will be teaming up with his totally not dead I Promise buddy Tails to set things right. The game builds off of the engine from Sonic 2 and introduces Tails as a playable character, complete with his flight ability, while also upgrading Sonic to feature his iconic spin dash and what the game calls the spike dash, which is really just the super peel out from Sonic CD. Once again, I'm surprised by how much Aspect managed to squeeze out of Sega's 8-bit hardware. These abilities aren't a perfect match for how they work on the Genesis or anything, but it's still cool to see them make an appearance. The super peel out is especially strange to see too, at least until you check the release date of this thing and see that it basically came out back to back with Sonic CD. Anyway, Sonic and Tails' levels appear to be identical, with the only real difference between the two being how much easier it was to get around while playing as Miles helicoptering the Chaos Emerald's Tails Prower. The level designs themselves also seem to be significantly simplified compared to what the last game tried to accomplish. It makes the Game Gear version of Sonic Chaos one of the most playable ones in this video. Its improved playability, however, doesn't necessarily make it particularly fun. The main issue here is that it feels a bit too much like an overcompensation for the mistakes made with Sonic 2. The overly complex and ambitious level designs from that game have been largely pushed aside in favor of layouts that emphasize a high, medium, low path approach that's more or less similar to what fans got on the Genesis version of Sonic 2. The only problem with that, though, is that none of these paths were particularly interesting because they also didn't want to make the game too hard. Whereas Sonic 2's multiple paths allowed you to skip water sections in some of its levels, or allowed you to rack up lives and rings to enter special stages, Sonic Chaos's offerings managed to feel a lot more hollow despite doing the same basic things, which totally decentivizes you from wanting to master any of these stages. With the first two 8-bit games, you were encouraged to explore the levels because it potentially meant finding the Chaos Emerald so that you could get the good endings for both games. With Sonic Chaos, though, you don't really need to explore the stages at all in order to grab those Chaos Emeralds. This is because the game now requires you to play as Sonic and grab 100 rings before automatically warping him to a unique special stage where he'll need to find the Chaos Emerald before time runs out. And okay, jettisoned on its own, I actually love that idea in theory. The Chaos Emerald searches might rely on memorization a bit too much for my liking, but they're fun and I like how we're automatically sent to these stages. They feel like the best use of the game's new items too, which I'll get back to in a second, and also like they successfully add some variety to the game without just changing its mechanics wholesale for a minute. However, there's no reason to get the Chaos Emeralds. Without trying to avoid anyone's funeral, you only get a different ending, which you could also just get if you play as Tails, by the way, since he can't even enter special stages in the first place. Because he's a ghost, maybe.
He's a phantom.
Basically, there's nothing waiting for you outside of bragging rights if you decide to 100% the game. Entering special stages also has the double-edged sword of sending you back to the beginning of whatever act in the zone you got warped from, meaning that you could hypothetically be at the very end of a level, get Van's warp toured into a bonus game, and then need to race through the level again afterwards. Which, you know, isn't great. I know Sonic games are designed to be replayable by nature, but forcing a player to run through a stage they had mostly just completed because they dared try to get the true ending to your game is just a bit... Oh. I beat it again. Okay. Well, I've got egg written all over my face. Right, so even though the special stages do throw you back to go like you're in a damn game of Monopoly, the stages in Sonic Chaos are pretty short. So short that combined with the streamlined layouts of the stages themselves, you can literally hit right and get to the end of some stages with only a few well-placed jumps to help keep you out of trouble, which unsurprisingly results in the game being an absolute snore at points. Aspect tries to mix things up by throwing a few power-ups your way in the game, and while they do add some much-needed spice to things, they also feel underutilized within the stages themselves. The only place where these items really shined was in their respective special stages where they're given the room to breathe and actually be interesting. In the normal stages though, they just feel like a glorified tease so that you can acquaint yourselves with them. Also, I may be reaching here, but it feels kinda weird to be using pogo boots and rocket shoes in a Sonic game to begin with. They're far from being the sort of power-ups you'd get in a Mario adventure, but yeah, this feels a bit more becoming of an Inspector Gadget thing than a Sonic power-up. Strangely enough, Sonic Chaos also tends to run into a lot more slowdown than I remembered in Sonic 1 or Sonic 2. Granted, it also throws in stuff like the corkscrew from Emerald Hill Zone on Sonic 2's Genesis version, so it's kind of understandable that it does, but it also does mean that the game's probably pushing the Game Gear to its limits. Visually, the game looks, look, to be blunt, I thought that Sonic Chaos was the least appealing one of the bunch for most of my time playing through these games until I ended up getting to... we'll get to it in a bit. The game looks mostly fine, and to be honest, it's exactly what you'd expect it to be, but there were a couple of details in it that really rubbed me the wrong way. For example, Sonic's sprite looks extremely pissed off the entire time he's on screen, and some of these stages ended up feeling a whole lot like Green Hill Zone with a twist, which is kinda par for the course when it comes to Sonic games, but felt especially egregious in this one. Counting the special stages, which aren't Green Hill Zone but do borrow the same basic color scheme from it, there are 3 GHZ composites in Sonic Chaos. There's the first area in the game, Turquoise Hill Zone, the special stages I just mentioned, and a third zone that's literally called Mecha Green Hill Zone, which isn't even green on account of all the mecha they've plastered all over it and it taking place during a sunset. Tangentially, I think that's where the Sunset Green Hill motif in Sonic Mania Plus came from, since that game has a few references to the handheld games in general. Also, Mecha Green Hill Zone? What, did aliens come to Earth and replace the real level with a robotic doppelganger? My point is that the game wasn't much to write home about visually, nor was the music even really worth getting hung up over. Its soundtrack does all it's supposed to do, and none of it's particularly offensive or anything, but I don't know. Maybe the charm or gimmick of Sonic on the Go is starting to wear thin on me or something, but it just didn't really leave much of an impression on me. I think its gameplay is better than Sonic 2's was, but it was also a lot less exciting on almost every front. When it comes to most creative endeavors, I'd rather someone try to be ambitious and fail miserably as opposed to playing it safe and boring, and in the case of Sonic Chaos, it just kinda leaned towards the latter of the two. If you're truly curious about this game, I'd say give it a shot sometime. It isn't terrible or anything, it just wasn't particularly special. It's a B-.
Too easy. Piece of cake.
Coming up next, we have the misleadingly titled Sonic Triple Trouble, a game that's technically the 4th one put out on the Game Gear, the 3rd one by Aspect, and the first and only one to not get a cross-platform release on the Master System. Released in November 1994, it follows Sonic and Tails on a quest to, take over the world. No, to stop Robotnik from taking over the world, and this time around he's also tricked Captain Knuckles into helping him keep you at arm's length. Technically again. It also introduced Fang the Sniper, who's also known as Knack the Weasel, as a new nemesis for you to butt heads with before he promptly doesn't appear in anything else other than a few other Game Gear titles and Sonic the Fighters. Oh, and he's also gonna be appearing in the upcoming Sonic Superstars 2, so, yeah, that's cool. Also, before I go any further, I just want to drop a note that I'm well aware is Sonic Triple Trouble's fan-created remake. While I won't be talking about it in this video since it doesn't really belong in a project spotlighting the Game Gear releases, I wanted to mention it because it's an extremely impressive title that basically does to Sonic Triple Trouble what Sonic Mania did for his Genesis games. It's available on PC, Mac, Linux, and Android, and it's free too, so check it out if that sounds interesting. The basic controls and physics are in line with what was on display in Sonic Chaos. As Sonic, you'll still have access to your spin dash and super peel out, while Tails can still fly like an eagle after standing front row at a Steve Miller Band concert. Oh, and you can also skip like a stone on water, which was something you could also do in the last 2 games that I forgot to mention. Frankly, the whole game plays like an extension of Sonic Chaos. The level designs are still simpler than what Sonic 2 had going for it, the special stages come in all shapes and sizes, and the power-ups from the last game even come back to be, well, even more inconsequential than they were there. There honestly isn't that much more I could say about Sonic Triple Trouble outside of that though, since it's so similar to Sonic Chaos. I mean, it's a huge improvement over the last game in basically every way, but at the same time, it's also just another 8-bit Sonic game. You run from left to right, crush some bad guys, fight bosses, and save the day, or not if you decide to turn the game off first. But at the same time, it was also the high point of all these games for me. The levels were a lot more fun to explore, the difficulty curve felt a bit more even-keeled than the outright frustration of Sonic 2 or the absolute snooze of Sonic Chaos, and the level themes also felt a bit more varied too. They even feel like they borrow a bit from Sonic 3's philosophy of creating massive stage designs for you to run around and explore. Because of this, the exploration that was a hallmark of the first two games and Green Hill Zone is back in full force, as is the need to track down a Chaos Emerald on the stage itself. In order to find your chaotic bling in Triple Trouble, you'll need to break a Chaos Emerald box that's tucked away within the act while carrying 50 rings so that you get warped to one of several special stages. Or, if you're like me and you tend to get tongue-twisted quite easily, one of special several stages. If you can complete the maze or special minigame you get tossed into, you'll get dropped into a mini boss fight with Fang, and once you beat him, have officially gotten your freak on and collected the emerald. Stuff like that was great, and it's emblematic of how well thought out this game is. Whereas Sonic Chaos had the problem of not motivating you to want to explore, promising extra boss fights and challenges to players looking to go the extra mile serves as a great bonus for people who want to get the most out of their game. Plus, even if you don't care about exploration itself, the larger levels successfully balance flowing as a linear action stage without relying on way too many straight and simple paths like they did in Chaos. These levels actually feel like Sonic levels, complete with loops, tight platforming sections, and the usual slew of jump pads and tubes that we've come to expect from the Game Gear games. Which is something I've continually failed to mention up until this point, so yeah, I'm finally gonna need to bring this up. A major aspect of every game that was made by Oh Wow Aspect has been the inclusion of these tubes that are basically identical to the ones from Futurama.
Crosstown Express?
And to be fair, I don't dislike them or anything, but I do find it funny that they keep showing up in the final act of every game to the point of basically being Aspect's calling card, as is throwing in a mechanized Sonic as an endgame boss because, yeah, Metal Sonic's also just straight up here too. Visually, Sonic Triple Trouble also tries to outshine its predecessor. The character sprite for Sonic himself still looks a bit off for my tastes, but he's definitely a bit more on model than he was last time around. If I had to describe the way he looks here, it's that he looks a bit like the claymation Sonic from that Japanese Sonic 1 commercial when he's jamming on top of a car. It can look a bit uncanny at points in my eyes, but it's clear and well rendered, even if I don't necessarily agree with the direction they took his look in. If you have any experience with bootleg Sonic games, you might also recognize his sprite here as being the one that was stolen for the infamous Sonic 3D Blast 5 on the Game Boy. A game that I actually own on a bootleg cart, by the way. Anyway, it's crazy to go from Sonic 1 on the Game Gear to this though. In just a few years, the leaps made in designing Sonic for an 8-bit screen are hard not to be at least a little blown away by. The environments are similar in that they're trying especially hard to take things to the next level. Much like with Sonic's sprite though, I do think the direction they took things in didn't really work for me. Looking at this and Sonic Chaos's Green Hill composites side by side, it's easy to see how Triple Trouble added a ton of detail to the stages, using tricks like dithering to add dimension to the clouds and introduce shading to the ground. There's a zone that takes place in the forest too, and while a lot of it can end up looking a bit samey, it's such a huge punch up from, say, Jungle Zone in Sonic 1 that it isn't even funny. Oh, and Triple Trouble also has cutscenes this time around, though they're all basically just reskinned variants of the Angel Island to Hydrocity Zone transition in Sonic 3. It's a nice compliment to what I said earlier about Triple Trouble taking some cues from that game though, so that's cool. As for the music, it's fine. I mean, the music's good, don't get me wrong, but it also doesn't really clear the line of being good Sonic music either, you know? It sort of falls into the same bucket that Sonic Chaos's music did for me of getting the job done and having a good tune or two to its name while simultaneously not offering much in the way of memorable themes. However, I do also want to preface this by saying that I have relatively high expectations for Sonic soundtracks in general, since they're Sonic soundtracks and that it usually means that they're pretty top-notch stuff. Even though my review of it may have come off as a little humdrum since I'm, like 4 reviews into a 5 review video, I really think this is the one I'd recommend checking out the most if you could only pick one. It offers the closest thing to a Genesis caliber Sonic experience while still having unique elements of its own. Sonic Triple Trouble firmly lands itself in the A tier for me, just barely edging out Sonic 1.
Yeah, this is perfect!
I'm sure you all want me to do this right, don't you? Sonic Blast is a menu item at the Sonic fast food eatery that's comprised of vanilla ice cream that's been mixed with Butterfingers and can have Oreos added. Fine, whatever. I guess I'll do it for real. Sonic Blast is the final traditional 2D Sonic platformer for the Game Gear, though it also got a Master System version a year later that was exclusive to Brazil. It came out in 1996 and uses a pre-rendered graphic technique that's similar to Donkey Kong Country and its namesake, Sonic 3D Blast. The change in graphical style gives it a look that sort of makes everything resemble action figures, which was so in vogue back then and also looks like it was made using enough plastique to level a building. Anyway, Robotnik's at it again, and this time around it's up to Sonic and Knuckles to tell him to cut it out. That's right, instead of your trusty sidekick Tails being the second playable character, Aspect decided to give us a little Knuckles action for a change of pace. Despite looking worse than that Pakistani Happy Meal toy commercial he's in, he controls just like he does in Sonic 3 and Knuckles, and because he can do everything he could in that game, effectively serves as this game's easy mode. Thanks to the extra mobility granted by his ability to effortlessly glide through the air, issues like screen crunch are sort of brushed to the side. As for when you're playing as Sonic, not so much. If anything, the screen crunch may be even worse here on account of the character sprites being a bit larger than usual than they were in the other games, which I'm assuming was done in order to preserve some of the detail on them. According to my very rough math, this game's Sonic sprite is approximately 15% larger than Triple Trouble's at 38 pixels tall versus 32. And that may not sound like much, but when your console's native height is only 144 pixels tall, well, that 15% difference ends up eating 4% more than it would have otherwise. This ultimately leads to Sonic Blast's level designs feeling like a regression from the previous title's level layout philosophy. Things aren't entirely linear or straightforward here, nor are the levels small or anything, but they do feel cramped and like objects are more or less constantly stacked directly on top of each other. The action itself feels a lot slower and stiffer too. With the larger character model eating up so much of the screen, the camera scrolls more quickly than it did in previous games, but it's also squandered since anything encroaching a natural satisfying feeling when you bounce off of enemies or roll up and down a hill is completely lost. It lacks that pop of momentum you'd get in the other games when you destroy a badnik, making the combat lifeless and boring. It's a shame too, because by all accounts, the combat may have actually had some potential to be fun here. Sonic swapped out the super peel out in this game in favor of a double jump that could have been fun to experiment with when fighting enemies, but instead, it's really just here to help you explore the stages or to compensate for obstacles you couldn't see when you made your first jump. To quote that time Nick Miller dressed up like Spooter Dooter or whatever,
it's a leap of faith.
Unique special stages are out of the picture this time too. Whenever you enter a special stage, which can be done by running into a donut ring like the one in Sonic 3 or Sonic 3D Blast, you'll get warped to a hodgepodge of the half pipe from Sonic 2 or Blue Sphere. All you have to do in these stages is collect a prerequisite number of rings before the stage ends and you're warped back to your zone. It's simple, it's plain, and while the perspective shift is impressive in the same way that Space Harry or an Afterburner on the Master System are impressive, it doesn't do much for me. The game also has boss battles. That's it. That's all I have to say about them. In all seriousness, most of them are quite literally the same boss fight served up several times on a platter. Robotnik will move from left to right, and it's up for you to hit his weak spot. Now, not all of them are this way, and there will be cosmetic differences when they are, such as a baffling reference to Journey to the West in one case, but it was shocking to see this be the case nonetheless. The one boss fight that I have to concede as being pretty cool is the last one though. It's basically a totally random game of Breakout you'll be playing along a spool or conveyor belt of sorts against Dr. Robotnik. For what it is, it's actually pretty fun and unique, though words also don't come close to describing how caught off guard I was by it. Still, I guess it was almost a prediction of sorts for how Sonic Team themselves would choose to end 2022's Sonic Frontiers with a glorified game of Space Invaders. Here's hoping that a future Sonic game decides to end things with a full-on playthrough of Super Mario Bros, am I right? Like, can you imagine Sonic the Hedge Boy squaring up against Dr. Wakey Eggs and Bakey only to have him pull a Terrence Darby and force him to race through a full Mario game? Honestly, I'd be pretty into that. Like, this isn't even a bit. If I was playing a Sonic game for like 20 hours, got to the end of it, and then had to play through all of Super Mario Bros., I'd be into it. As for Sonic Blast's very distinctive art style, while I will concede that it's impressive as hell that it manages to use the graphical technique that Donkey Kong Country and Mortal Kombat used to great effect, I don't think it was a particularly smart move for this game. Once the novelty of those chonky graphics wears off, you'll basically notice that the pre-rendered graphics don't really blend in with the environments. In the first act, the stage itself might be detailed, but it also clashes with the blue background and delightfully pitiful gradient that's supposed to be on the horizon. In the water zone, the water is depicted by a blue box. A literal blue box. And even in the stages that have a better grasp on making the art style more cohesive, they still end up feeling uncanny since the limitations of the hardware's color palette or sprite sizes prevents an adequate enough level of detail from being applied to them. The music's also bad. I wouldn't say it's that much worse than the low points in some of the other games I covered today. Heck, I even like the music to Red Volcano Zone, but the vast majority of it goes down as being some of the blandest music to ever make it into a Sonic game. On its own, I might go as far as to say it's okay, but when you couple it with how utterly dull the gameplay was, it quickly becomes torture. You wanna know my thoughts on Sonic Blast? Here they are. Don't play it unless you absolutely, positively need to experience every Sonic game under the sun. Like, by fear of death. It's not that it's offensively bad or anything, but rather that it's just aggressively mediocre.
Mediocre?
It does have a few good things going for it, like a genuinely fun final boss fight and a surprisingly stable frame rate for a Game Gear Sonic platformer, but I also wouldn't say that these things come anywhere close to being enough to justify giving it a go. Sonic Blast comes in Sonic Last with a D.
Huh, no problem.
Ultimately, the Sonic platformers I covered today are pretty fun. While a lot of them fail to live up to the level of quality we expect from the Genesis titles, a few of them did get a bit close, and on top of that, they're still mostly fun and rewarding experiences that you should totally revisit. Even in the case of something like Sonic Blast, it really wasn't that bad. And like, if you're gonna take the time to play through the other 4 games, you may as well just play through it too for bragging rights, since all these games are only about 40 minutes to an hour long. One of the things I found so interesting with these games is that they all inevitably ended up complementing a major aspect of the mainline Sonic game they got released alongside. Sonic 1 was a bit like the Genesis game. Sonic 2 had Mecha Sonic and Tails. Sonic Chaos was a bit like Sonic CD in how it tried to emphasize exploration and was extremely easy. Sonic Triple Trouble's stage layouts felt vaguely inspired by Sonic 3 and featured a lot of Knuckles. In Sonic Blast, it's, well, literally in the name what it did there. I think it's awesome that these games are now available on Sonic Origins Plus. While I would have loved to see the Master System versions get used instead, I can confidently say that the Game Gear releases are more than serviceable enough for most of these games. The only one that really suffered from the screen crunch to the point of it being a detriment to the gameplay was Sonic 2. The rest of them were more than playable though. Anyway, that brings us to the end of this video. I hope you enjoyed it, and that if you did, you hit the like button, answer the question of the day if you haven't over in the comments, and just like, I don't know, maybe share the video with a couple of friends of yours. These videos take a super long time to make, and honestly, any support I could get from you guys would be really appreciated. You could also subscribe to my Patreon or donate to my Buy Me a Coffee via the links in the description or pinned comment if you want to support the channel that way, and you could follow me on Twitter and Instagram by looking up @NichePlays on those respective platforms. So yeah, bye!